So, all right, there I am. I'm figuring out this live stream thing. Cool. Yeah, Anissa, I am not visiting Europe, as someone commented. I am in the US, but I love Europe. Lots of great threat analysts over there who contributed to this Anissa report. So, want to dive into some of that content today for you. So, this report just came out recently in November. And what's cool, I think, especially if you're in the US like I am, right, gives you right an overview of what they're seeing sort of from a European perspective, right? And diving in, a lot of these reports have kind of a landing page there, and then you can download the additional PDF, which is cool. We've talked in various places about, right, in various streams about the importance of having great graphics. And I wanted to highlight this awesome infographic from this report, right? Pretty easy at a high level to see here are the top cyber threats the ANISA team is focusing on, right? Ransomware, malware, social engineering threats, etc. So, kind of a nice overview if you don't have time to read their 150-page report. Kind of impressive. And while I'm talking about this, I'll just drop it into the comments in case you all want to follow along. I see one person doesn't have sound. Hopefully, the rest of y'all have sound so you can hear me okay. But yeah, you can follow along for these reports later. Drop that in so you can follow along at home as well. 150 pages. And right, maybe you don't have time to read the entire thing, right, cover to cover, but you can check out table of contents and kind of dive into the section that you care about. What I like about this report in particular is that it divides by the types of threats, right? Ransomware, malware, threats against availability, thinking of that confidentiality, integrity, and availability thing, right? Thinking about those different categories of attacks. So, right, there's always summaries, which is kind of nice if you don't have time to read the whole thing. Summarizing key points like, hey, that Russia Ukraine conflict, kind of a key thing that happened in 2022. Hacktivism and disinformation, the roles of those two categories, right? So, awesome kind of summary here. And then, based on what you find in the summary that might be more or less applicable, kind of deep dive into the different sections here, right? Here's the overview. Again, a really meaty report, a lot of content here. But especially if you're not a person who has time to read every single threat report all the time, right? This is a great way that you can kind of catch up on all of these different threats with a single report. So, a couple things I also wanted to highlight in here as you scroll down, right? Really cool graphs. I really enjoy looking at trends over time. And a lot of these graphics can kind of help us do that, right? Look at when were certain categories, right, and certain domains prevalent. Threats by sector. This is something that a lot of folks are commonly interested in, rather, right? And of course, it's important to remember that for each of these reports, no one has perfect visibility, right? Anisa only has their limited data set, but it's kind of neat, right? You can see, for example, okay, across different months for each year, which sectors were highly impacted. And probably not a shock to a lot of you who track threat landscapes, public administration, governments, right? We see like a lot of patterns in July and August 2021 and right, April, July. So it can be really interesting to look at right prevalence of incidents that were reported over different months. Right? Targeted sectors, again, you can see public administration, government continues to be a really widely targeted sector based on this data set. So interesting findings there by sector. Different sectors might have different actions they want to take as well. So this report also kind of describes different actions you can take based on what you're seeing. So by sector impact, right? Breakdown there. Another interesting category to look at is the motivation of different threat actors, right? So this is a cool visual, kind of this like left to right diagram. They're using these different high level categories, threat categories, right? Data, denial of service, malware, misinformation or disinformation, and then kind of aligning those on top of these different categories, right? Which allows us to see, okay, data threats pretty predominant across, but especially in monetization and geopolitical espionage motivated actors. So, kind of a cool pattern here in these different threat categories. Again, 150 pages that you can scroll through. So hats off to the team at Anissa. My friend Andreas was one of the authors of this. So really worth a deep dive. Anissa, not the only ones who've published these annual reports. The ACSC, the Australian Cybersecurity Center, also published a recent report on threat landscapes. And you find that, right, various threat reports come out at different times of the year, right? Some organizations track their years July to June, others might track, right, the calendar year. So ACSC, again, especially if you're in the US or maybe you're in Europe, taking a look at the reports of different organizations in different regions of the world is really important because sometimes there's geopolitics that might affect different regions of the world. So, really helpful to take a look at the ACSC report as well. Right? This one only 74 pages instead of 150, but they have a lot of awesome graphics in this one as well, right? Again, highlighting some of the key trends, some incident statistics, etc. And my recommendation is as you look across all these different threat landscape reports, looking for commonalities, right? What does ANISA see that ACSC also sees? Oh, yeah. I think I dropped the link in there, Mohammed. Let me just drop that in for the LinkedIn folks as well. So hopefully you can see that. If you just Google ACSC cyber threat report, you'll also find it that way. So, a couple trends that they called out here, right? Exploitation of critical public vulnerabilities. Right, this is something that we know any organization really needs to keep an eye on. Any new vulnerabilities that come out, thinking about how quickly adversaries exploit them, and right, the finding here that actors pretty quickly figure out how to exploit new vulnerabilities that come out. Targeting of critical infrastructure, right? This is another concerning thing, especially if you work supporting those organizations, right? Helping out those critical infrastructure orgs who are increasingly targeted. So, ransomware. A lot of people like to say ransomware, right? It's going away, it's better. Well, not completely gone. So, ransomware remains one of the most destructive threats to any organization. So, kind of important threat to focus on still. So scrolling through, right, again, great use of graphics. One category that a lot of these threat reports talk about BEC, business email compromise. A lot of different things can be meant by that, but right, often this involves some kind of social engineering where an adversary will email a victim and say, "Hey, wire me money." And this is one that, as ACSC said, right, increase of over 98 million over the year, right? Average loss of $64,000 per report of a BEC incident. And right, this just highlights the fact that BEC, even though it often takes advantage of social engineering, maybe there's even no malware involved, can be really, really damaging. So, some other findings, right? Vulnerabilities, as we talked about, increase in the number of vulnerabilities, which I would actually argue may not be a bad thing, right? The more people we have, the more researchers we have looking for those flaws in code, naturally, the more vulnerabilities are going to be found. So, some interesting findings there. And again, ACSC being honest about, hey, here's our visibility, here's the response that we did. Other sections you might want to dive into here, right? What should people do? And I really like how ACSC divided this. If you're an individual reading this report, I know it's not exciting, but update your devices. If you're on like an end of life device that can't get updates, maybe get a new one, right? Updating should be as common as brushing our teeth. Multi-factor authentication, right? And again, this is something looking for commonalities across different people who share cyber threat information. MFA is something that DHS out of the US has been emphasizing. In fact, ACSC also emphasizes it means, yeah, using multi-factor is probably a good thing across your different accounts, right? So they broke it down into, right, individual actions and then organizations. Things like whatever framework you use, the CIS top 10, ACSC's 8 mitigation strategies. There's guidance from CISA, right? Trying to use some of those frameworks, patching, of course, right, with the finding on the threat landscape of actors, right, more quickly exploiting vulnerabilities. The recommended mitigation for that is patching. And of course, realizing that this is sometimes easier said than done. If anyone's ever tried to patch an Exchange server, not super easy to do, takes quite a while. So, right, again, great report from ACSC, just emphasizing this idea that you want to have visibility from different parts of the world, especially those that are maybe different than yours, because maybe there's a threat that might hit your region in the future. Another cool summary report I wanted to call out is the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So, this is kind of a neat one. I'll drop links in for you as well to this one. This uses Microsoft's kind of massive and impressive visibility, right, across all of their telemetry that they gather. And this one, a lot of great graphics here as well. This one's only 114 pages, but again, you can kind of skim it through and think about the sections that are like interesting to you, right? Talks about the visibility. Anytime you're reading any of these reports, it's helpful to understand, right? Where are they getting their data? So, always helpful to look at that. Starts out talking about cybercrime. And again, looking for themes across these reports. Well, human operated ransomware. That's a pretty important one to focus on, right? One third of targets are successfully compromised by criminals using these attacks. 5% of those are ransomed. And even if it's just 5%, that's a huge number of organizations. So, kind of a nice infographic allows you to easily skim this. And again, another pattern. Most effective defenses against ransomware include multi factor authentication and patching. It's not the most exciting stuff, but it works. Zero trust. So, cybercrime. Also, they present information on, of course, details of ransomware. Scrolling through, if maybe you care a little bit more about the nation state or state sponsored attacks, right? There's a separate section on that. And this is where, right, depending on your specific threat model, if you've joined us before in previous months, right, you know, we talk about threat modeling. And I'd argue for most organizations, this first section on cybercrime might be one of the more important sections for you to focus on. But maybe you're supporting NGOs, non government organizations, or government organizations, or critical infrastructure. Yeah, maybe this nation state threat section is the most important to you. So, kind of a nice organization there. You can choose the section that is most interesting to you. So, again, Microsoft Digital Defense Report, another wealth of information. And I like to highlight these again because it sort of saves you some time from having to read all of these separate reports, summarizes key trends based on different visibility. So, that's the first section I wanted to talk about, summary threat landscape reports. I find a lot of these also come out around like the February, March timeframe. So I'll certainly do another roll up in a future month of reports when they come out in the future. Cool. So moving on, next topic I wanted to hit was actually just a specific blog post from Microsoft, right? We all know that as we are looking at the threat landscape, adversaries are increasingly operating in cloud environments, right? We all use cloud environments because easy to scale, it's cheap, it's convenient. Adversaries are adapting their tactics, techniques, and procedures to cloud environments. And this piece from Microsoft talks about cloud token theft. Right? It's really important, again, that we shift our thinking from just thinking about operating systems, right? Defending the endpoint to thinking about how we defend in the cloud. And as always, right? Talking about multi factor authentication here, but the thing about token theft is that this is a way adversaries can actually bypass, well, not officially bypass, but kind of take advantage of the way MFA works and these tokens work to effectively bypass the multi-factor authentication, right? So adversaries are upping their game, so to speak, as you know, maybe we implement MFA and they're like, cool, how can I get around that? So what I like about this blog in particular is there are a lot of diagrams that make it a little easier to understand. So I'll scroll to the one that kind of talks about this adversary in the middle phishing attack, right? So adversaries, instead of just stealing usernames and passwords, they can steal these tokens that, as this blog explains, right, allows users to authenticate, once they've already gone through multi-factor authentication. So this diagram kind of breaks down how this works, right? Adversary gains initial access somehow. Phishing email is one of the most common techniques. Then, right, the adversary will access that token from the user, right? Not just taking their credentials, but also that token. And then when they replay that session token, that essentially bypasses multi-factor because that token's already been granted when the user legitimately entered their multi-factor authentication. So then an adversary can kind of gain that access. So lots of different ways described in this blog post that adversaries can use these tokens to bypass different types of authentication. So really worth considering and worth thinking about, right? How would you try to prevent this, protect against this, or detect it? Right. And as always, Microsoft blog posts have really great recommendations along all of those lines. Right. Reducing the viable time of a token. I don't know about you. I personally don't like logging in a whole lot. Well, that's really nice if your token, reauthentication is really long for a user, but for an adversary, right? It's nice if I only have to log in once every 30 days, an adversary only has to do that too. Shortening that viable time might be one protection, right? Blocking that initial access, of course, if you prevent phishing to let the adversaries steal these tokens in the first place, that can be effective. Lots of great recommendations. Detection is something also really interesting. Various vendors have different identity solutions, right, that might detect anomalous token events. So just going in and looking in your existing security stack, do you have any kind of alerts that would alert on this kind of behavior? Could be one takeaway from this token theft blog post. I always like to insert some cloudy focused threat content because, again, it's something that we as a community really have to shift and start thinking about how our adversaries behaving a little differently in those cloud environments. All right, moving right along to our next tab, Emotet. Right, Emotet is sort of one of those nefarious malware families, and as you might recall, right, Emotet went away. There was a really massive government and private sector takedown, right? I think it was last year. Time flies when you're having fun. So Emotet had a very effective takedown by government, by private sector, and it worked for a while. But what we see is kind of like one of those like inflatable clown things. You punch it and it comes right back. So Emotet is back, and folks at Proofpoint do awesome work. They see so many emails, so they can see this activity. And I really like this volume, right? Over 5 years, here's the volume they've seen of Emotet. And I like this because it kind of shows the ebbs and flows, right? 2018, right? Around December, October 2018, really, really high volume of Emotet, right? We see 2020. And then, sort of the last time, right, we saw Emotet in mass was around summer of 2022. And now you can see, right, a little spike here towards the end of October, early November. And so it's really worth watching these patterns over time because now this tells us, hey, we need to start watching for Emotet again. I don't know about you, but right, we are kind of like, we have other things to focus on, lots of other malware. So let's deprioritize Emotet. Well, Emotet's back, to quote the Eminem song, right? Emotet's back, back again. So the good news is that a lot of the delivery still via very similar techniques that other adversaries use, right? Different lures, IRS lures, etc. So worth checking out this blog post, thinking about the different techniques they're using, right? Some screenshots from Proofpoint of different types of phishing emails that have delivered Emotet, right? Attachments, very common method to get Emotet in environments, usually Excel or maybe a password protected zip with an Excel document using Excel for macros, right? Which is sort of a more recent version of those Excel macros. So, worth checking this blog out, thinking about how you could detect or defend against this. Another really interesting aspect of this, right? It's really important to think about the actor and the malware separately, right? So if you look towards the beginning of this blog post, Proofpoint explains that the actor they track that distributes Emotet malware, they call them TA542, right? And why this matters is, of course, malware can change hands, right? Malware can be used by one actor and then maybe someone else buys it, steals it, etc. That malware can actually change hands. So TA542 is the actor who's predominantly distributing Emotet malware right now. So taking a look at some other malware families that are involved, right? And this is what's kind of interesting. And in this section, I want to talk about some of these other types of malware families we often see along with Emotet, right? So interestingly enough, when we're talking about that actor, the TA542, okay, they kind of chilled for a while, but it was interesting. Proofpoint noted that someone, right, some group working around this, right, delivered XM rig. It's a common coin miner seen on a lot of different organizations that was installed by Emotet during this time frame. So, right, what we often see is that we don't just see one malware family on the endpoint. Sometimes we'll see Emotet plus XM rig or Emotet plus some different family. So again, really detailed blog post in here. It's always important whenever you see malware returning, looking at the differences, right? New commands, new packers. And what this means, why this matters is, right, as threat intel people, you want to be communicating about those differences so that your defenders can update. How do we detect, or maybe our prevention is a little bit different as well. So always good to look at how things are changing. Do we have to change up how we detect these? Right. I mentioned that Emotet has been seen with XMRig. Another malware family that Emotet's been seen with is Iced ID, another common malware family, one of these ransomware precursor families. So Emotet plus Iced ID now seem to be teaming up, which is kind of interesting, right? So you can read about that from Proofpoint. The folks over at Unit 42 have also seen this pattern, right? They also saw Iced ID being dropped from an Emotet infection. And so, again, a lot of times you don't just have one malware family to worry about, you have multiple families. And in this specific one, the Unit 42 shared, not just Emotet and Iced ID, but also Bumblebee malware. So, again, important to know that sometimes you have to look for multiple of these different families. So, kind of covering a few different malware families in this section, right? Bumblebee has also been seen, right, with Iced ID and Emotet. I highly recommend checking out this new blog post from the DFIR report on Bumblebee. So, DFIR report, folks, we had them on the live stream a couple months ago. Really, really great work. If you're not already checking out this blog post, highly recommend it. And this was an interesting intrusion they tracked where the adversaries used this Bumblebee malware as the initial access. And then the adversary dropped a bunch of different tools. So, kind of a nice summary. If you tuned in when they were on the live stream, they revealed that their timelines, they actually just create these using mind map software. So, kind of a nice timeline here. Again, Bumblebee being used for that initial access. And they used an ISO file type, right? Common kind of container type that a lot of adversaries are using for their initial phishing attachments. So an ISO file was delivered with Bumblebee. Then, right, starting run DLL32, one of those living off the land binaries that is very detectable, weird behavior there. And then Bumblebee executed this tool called Meterpreter, which you might have heard of, right? Meterpreter is both a red teaming tool and a tool that adversaries use. And I really appreciated this snarky comment from someone on Twitter, like, cool, like you as a red teamer, maybe you spend hours building custom malware to bypass the most sophisticated defenses. And then real threat actors are like, cool, I'm just going to use Meterpreter, right? Meterpreter works in these intrusions, and so adversaries will often use it. And so if you've joined our live stream before or read the DFIR report, right, the key beacon of hope, I would say, for defenders is these intrusions, a lot of them look very similar, right? This one used run DL32, used Meterpreter, ran some discovery commands, right? So simple things that we've talked about previously, like looking for how common is that NL test DC list domain command, discovering aspects of the environment. How common is that in your enterprise? It's not very common. That's one that a lot of adversaries use to learn about the environment in different intrusions. So, as always, this is a blog post that is full of details, a lot of actionable detail that you can use for detection. So Bumblebee been pretty prevalent, right? This was from I think in May 2022, but Bumblebee still sticks around. And you might have seen if you're active on Twitter, I will go down with a ship. Twitter is not dead yet. There's a great conference, Cyber WarCon, and then one known as BrunchCon or SleuthCon, focused on cybercrime. And there was a great presentation from Genevieve Stark and Kimberly from Mandiant, where they talked about Bumblebee, which they call shell sting. And I really liked this slide that they presented, right? About how these different clusters of activity, just emphasizing this idea that often we see multiple different loaders and payloads during an intrusion, not just Bumblebee, right? So they saw Bumblebee plus Beacon, right, which is their name for Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, Sliver, another Cobalt Strike framework, Cobalt Strike like framework, rather, and Vidar, an info stealer. So I thought this was a kind of neat way to visualize hey, there are different kind of clusters of mix and match, right? Adversaries often don't just use one family. They might start with Bumblebee, then bring Beacon and Metasploit onto the system as well. So again, Bumblebee, one of those malware families worth checking out, along with Emotet and Iced ID. They've been pretty active lately. So worth keeping an eye on all of those because as we talked about previously, a lot of these affiliates partner with different ransomware actors, right? Maybe your initial access is via Emotet or Iced ID, and there's increasing evidence that sometimes these might result in ransomware later. So, speaking of ransomware, let's move to talk about ransomware. Why? Because it's still a thing. It's interesting, right? Kevin, an awesome journalist, noted that the FBI deputy director at a recent conference commented, right? We've only seen the problem of ransomware getting worse. We've seen higher volume of ransomware attacks, financial losses increasing as well. And I thought this is an interesting thread because, right, Leslie Carhart chiming in, we talk about it less because we're culturally desensitized. And I appreciated Kevin providing a really interesting perspective that as a journalist who's trying to cover ransomware, it's a little bit sad, but the stories are all kind of similar, right? You know, hospital, medical organization, big tech company, right? Small business, compromised by ransomware, adversaries post data to extortion site. It's really bad, right? Kind of tough to tell that same story over and over. So I would just challenge all of us that it's important we don't get desensitized rather to ransomware, right? This is still something that affects organizations. Same similar tactics and techniques are being used. So definitely worth keeping an eye on. And it was great. Right before I was preparing for this live stream, Microsoft dropped this blog on different ways that they've seen this dev group deliver Royal ransomware, which Royal is one that newer on the scene, right? It's been around for a little bit, but I think it's one of the more prevalent ones nowadays. Worth checking out this blog post. And again, just emphasizing, right, this idea that often the initial access affiliate passes off, right, the keys to that environment, and then ransomware is deployed. A couple of interesting things in this blog post that I wanted to highlight, right? This Dev0569 cluster relies on malvertising, right? Malicious ads, maybe using Google ads in campaigns. This is something that we see a lot of different actors do. And, right, it's very easy to be like, oh, it's just malvertising. I'm not really that concerned about this, right? So, a little bit concerning if you're just dismissing, oh, it's just malvertising. We don't need to worry. Well, Dev0569's activity has later led to ransomware. So this can be particularly tough to prevent because, right, sometimes what will happen is, okay, if a user is searching something on Google and then there's a Google ad for, I don't know, whatever I'm searching for, like cozy sweatpants to wear at home. right? And then I get an ad for cozy sweatpants. Sometimes those are malicious and it can be really tough to try to prevent that. So, one thing to keep an eye out, that malvertising initial access vector. This is another really interesting one that I would highly recommend talking to whomever your organization relies on to handle initial contacts through your contact website form, right? Why? Because this is what this one of the ways that this group has delivered phishing links, right? So, SANS, Red Canary, different places. You have a contact me. Hey, I want to talk to the Red Canary Intel team. I want info about a SANS course. Well, these adversaries have actually used those contact forms to deliver phishing links. And I think this is particularly effective because whomever is checking those, right, checking those emails, making sure people's questions are responded to, they might be, used to seeing a ton of volume. They might be a little more likely to click on something, right? Especially if, they think they're helping out someone contacting that org. So this is one in particular. Let whoever checks those contact form emails know about this, that, hey, adversaries are using that to try to deliver malicious content. So lots of detail here on their TTPs. As always, they do great work. Another malware family that's been really prevalent lately that you should be watching out for is called Batloader. There's a lot of debate. My team's debated this, and others have as well. Batloader is pretty similar to another family called Zloader, right? Some teams track them similarly, some teams track them differently. But regardless, this has been another really prevalent malware family later that is worth keeping an eye on. So again, right, different ways that they might gain initial access. Often they'll pose as legitimate installers. This is a way that adversaries, again, like to masquerade or blend in. So someone thinks, oh, my team uses a TeamViewer, for example. Like this looks pretty effective, right? If you thought you needed to download TeamViewer, a legitimate application many organizations use, you get a site like this, pretty darn convincing. So something else to make sure users are aware of. Another interesting aspect, right? The use of file formats like virtual hard disk, VHDs. And I would say this is sort of part of a larger trend of adversaries switching up their file formats they use, right? We mentioned ISO files. VHDs are another one to keep an eye on. Then our intrusion progresses, right? It starts with Batloader, uses PowerShell, then downloads additional stuff, right? Maybe other payloads. Similar theme that we've been talking about. Maybe it brings in Vidar or Bumblebee, which we previously talked about. Then, of course, everyone's favorite framework, Cobalt Strike, and then ultimately deploying that Royal ransomware. So, again, a lot of commonalities across all of these different intrusion chain types. That's why I recommend really focusing your priorities. Ransomware not dead. We'll continue to talk about this as long as this live stream is up and ransomware is a thing, which I suspect it will continue to be for quite a long time. All right, a slightly different ransomware case. This is really interesting one. You might have seen Prestige Ransomware. This blog was initially published right back in October by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center team, and they recently updated this with some attribution. So this was a ransomware variant that impacted both Ukraine and Poland. And right, a lot of people, when they first read this, they were like, oh, right, ransomware hitting Ukraine, Poland, especially transportation and logistics. It's got to be Russia. Well, if you've joined us before, you know that attribution is hard, especially attribution to a country. So I think Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, they waited until they had enough evidence to do attribution, which they just came out last week saying they were able to attribute this Prestige ransomware case to an actor known as Iridium, which is a Russia-based threat actor that overlaps with another group you might have heard of called Sandworm. So this is really interesting, right? And they kind of get into why this is so significant, right? The fact that these Russian actors were using ransomware, right, might highlight a shift in their calculus, right? Willingness to take more destructive actions. And so, again, talking about threat modeling, If you are in the transportation sectors, if you support different humanitarian organizations, if you provide military support to Ukraine, this is something that's very relevant to you. The other aspect of this that was really interesting was the fact that it didn't just hit Ukraine, it also hit Poland. And so, right, maybe changing in targeting potentially by these actors, an increased willingness to hit Polish targets, right? We know, and this is where geopolitics, the kinetic world, might intersect with the cyber world, right? Cyberspace. Earlier this week, there was a scare where there was some missile activity in Poland. There was uncertainty at first on was that deliberate? Was it not? Right? Based on best available evidence, it does not look like that was an intentional strike by Russian actors on Poland, but there was that uncertainty, right? And so when you take that uncertainty around kinetic targeting, it's important to also look at cyberspace and look how this prestige ransomware also hit Polish targets. So, kind of an interesting one, again, looking at how geopolitics and cyberspace overlaps. It's a good case study, especially if you're in those sectors. On the topic of Russian based adversaries, another really interesting piece that came out at Cyber WarCon last year was this one from Google's Threat Analysis Group. And I think this one's interesting to talk about because, right, it's not something I always talk about on this stream, the disinformation aspects. And this one's a fascinating case study just to understand how Russian actors, right, conduct information operations, right? So these are multiple different case studies tied to the Internet Research Agency, IRA, and then this Russian oligarch that finances it. And what I thought was fascinating about this is that this organization has actually financed movies, right, as part of their IO operations. Like these are really high quality production, right? If you take a look at some of the kind of ads for these, right, the movie Sunlight, it just kind of shows the extent that these actors will go to do these IO campaigns. So this might be one that, right, especially if you're someone who supports organizations who are in the media industry, right, might be interesting to you. But I think it's also just interesting to be aware of the types of information operations that Russian actors are doing, even if maybe it doesn't influence your day to day and the actions you would take. So, another great blog post from Tina and Tony over at Google's Threat Analysis Group. So, moving on from Russia stuff, I wanted to talk for just a moment about the US midterm elections because I think it's so easy as analysts to think about what we are seeing, right? We talked about all these things, right? Ransomware, we've seen stuff from Russia, cloud token theft, Emotet, etc. But I think what was notable about the US midterm elections that happened just, what was it, 2 weeks ago, is that there wasn't a whole lot of cyber threat activity around that. Right. So, just a quote here from a senior CISA official briefing reporters. There wasn't any specific credible threat to disrupt election infrastructure. Right. You might recall if you were tracking that day that there was some potential distributed denial of service attacks affecting maybe state election offices. Very minimal impact of that. So, yeah, it's interesting to sometimes look at what we've seen and what we haven't seen as well. So I think that's a positive for all the organizations who worked really hard to try to secure those elections. So just wanted to call that out as something that we haven't seen a ton of. Noting, yeah, I was trying to post the links as I went, but I'll make sure at the end I will post those as well if you want to go back and revisit any of these reports or tweets. All right. And with that, that's all I have for you today. Just a couple wrap up items I wanted to mention. SANS Cyber Defense Initiative. If you are looking to take a SANS course, I'm going to be teaching next at this one. It's in December. It's in DC. There are some fun events at night. These SANS Difference Maker Awards are going to happen then. So SANS CDI is coming up. And then one of my favorite events of the entire year, the SANS CTI Summit. This is going to be both in person and virtual, a hybrid event. It happens January 30th through 31st, and it is totally free for the virtual version. So you can register for that now. We've announced a couple of the speakers already, and we'll be finalizing more talks. So I can tell you, because I've gotten to see all the abstracts, that there's a lot of great content. So if you care about cyber threats, make sure to sign up for that SANS CTI Summit, January 30th through 31st. All right. Well, that's all I've got for you today. So thank you all so much for joining us on the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. Have a great holiday, and I hope to see you in a future month. Take care.